Ida, remembered by history as Ida de Tosny, Countess of Norfolk, royal ward, mistress of a king, and the mother of an earl whose name would outlast empires. She was born into one of the great Norman families of England, a lineage that had crossed the sea with William the Conqueror and carved its name into the very soil of a conquered nation. Her childhood was spent among the rolling fields of Hertfordshire, in a house that bore the weight of centuries. And then, when she was still very young, her father died, and the world she had known gave way to another entirely. She passed from her family's hands into the hands of a king. What followed would shape a dynasty, produce one of England's most celebrated earls, and leave almost no trace of the woman herself. For 800 years, her name was misread, her story misattributed, her identity absorbed into someone else's more famous legend. And then, in 1979, a scholar opened an old cartulary in a Wiltshire archive and found 5 words in medieval Latin that changed everything. Tonight, we follow that journey from the very beginning. Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy Crown Reborn. If you have just subscribed, welcome to the family. And if you are returning to us again, welcome back home. It is a pleasure, as always, to have you here. Tonight, make yourself comfortable, lower the lights, and let the day gently slip away. Over the next few hours, we will share the calm, complete story of Ida de Tosny, a Norman noblewoman of the 12th century, whose quiet life at the very heart of the Plantagenet court touched the course of English history in ways that would not be understood. For nearly 800 years, we will move gently through her world, from beginning to end, from the proud Norman halls of her childhood, in Flamstead, Hertfordshire, through the gilded turbulence of Henry II's great royal court, into the long and largely peaceful years of her marriage to Roger Bigod, Earl of Norfolk, and finally to the remarkable discovery, made centuries after her death, that restored her name to its rightful place in history. This story is told slowly and with care to help guide you into sleep. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a gentle like and a quiet comment about which part of Ida's story surprised you most help keep these tales coming. To understand Ida de Tosny, to understand where she came from, what world she entered, and why her story matters, we must begin not with Ida herself, but with the family that produced her, and that means beginning in Normandy, on the far side of the English Channel, in the years before the conquest that changed everything. The Tosnys, a name that appears in the historical record variously as Teeny, Tony, Tosny, de Tosny, and a dozen other spellings reflecting the fluid orthography of the medieval world, were one of the great Norman dynasties of the 11th century. They were not perhaps the most powerful family in the Duchy of Normandy, but they were old, and they were respected, and they had connections to the highest levels of Norman society that stretched back several generations before the events of 1066 brought the Normans to England. Their roots lay in a lordship centred on the town of Tosny, situated on the Seine, in the region of Upper Normandy. From this geographical base, the family took its name, as was the custom of the Norman aristocracy, and from this base they extended their reach through a combination of military service, advantageous marriage, and the kind of careful political positioning that allowed great families to survive the turbulence of 11th century politics. The founding figure of the Tosny family's greatness was Roger I de Tosny, whose career belongs to the early part of the 11th century. Roger fought against the Muslims in Catalonia in the campaigns of the Spanish March, the contested borderlands between Christian and Muslim Spain, and he built a reputation as a warrior of considerable consequence. His sons continued this tradition of military distinction, and by the time of William the Conqueror, the Tosnys were firmly established in the inner circle of the Norman duchy. Raoul II de Tosny, the family member most directly relevant to the conquest of England, served as the Norman standard-bearer in 1054, a role of extraordinary symbolic significance in the court of Duke William. To carry the standard was to stand at the visible centre of the Norman army, to be identified with the Duke's cause in the most public and prestigious way. It was an honour reserved for men who were trusted absolutely, and who had demonstrated both their loyalty and their military capability beyond any reasonable doubt. By the time William set his sights on England, by the time he began preparing the invasion fleet that would carry a Norman army across the Channel in the autumn of 1066, the Tosneys were fully committed to his cause. They were the kind of family that great lords needed behind them. Old, connected, capable, and loyal. And when William's army sailed and landed on the English coast at Pevensey Bay in September 1066, the Tosneys were among them. The Battle of Hastings on the 14th of October 1066 was one of the most consequential days in English history. King Harold of England met William's army on a ridge near the town of Hastings, and after a long and hard-fought engagement, Harold was killed, shot through the eye by an arrow, according to one tradition, or cut down by Norman cavalry in the confusion of the battle's final moments, according to others. The English army broke. The way to London was open, and in the weeks that followed, William marched north and took the crown. The rewards for service in this conquest were enormous. William distributed the lands of the defeated English aristocracy among his Norman followers with a thoroughness that transformed the social landscape of England within a generation. Anglo-Saxon lords were replaced by Normans. English land tenure was reorganized on Norman feudal principles. The French language became the language of the ruling class, and the great Norman families that had followed William across the Channel found themselves the masters of a wealthy and well-developed kingdom. Among those families were the Tosneys. For their participation in the conquest and its aftermath, they received significant grants of English land. Most importantly, they were given the barony of Flamstead in Hertfordshire, a grant that would become the family's primary English seat, the place from which they would govern their English holdings and from which the next several generations of Tosneys would grow and extend their reach. Flamstead itself was a modest settlement in the gently rolling Hertfordshire countryside, a village surrounded by agricultural land, positioned within reasonable riding distance of London, and situated near enough to the great road of Watling Street that it was well connected to the wider world of English commerce and communication. It was not spectacular. It was not one of the great lordships of England, but it was solid and productive, and it gave the Tosneys a stable English home from which to manage the rest of their affairs. And so, the Tosneys settled into their English life. They built or improved the manor house at Flamstead. They administered their tenants according to the new feudal system. They sent their sons to fight when the king required it, and their daughters to marry into other noble houses when alliance required it. They witnessed charters, attended councils, and participated in the governance of the new Anglo-Norman kingdom. They were, in every meaningful sense, part of the new order. Norman in origin and identity, English in residence and interest, fully integrated into the aristocratic world that the conquest had created. Generations passed. The Tosneys, who had fought at Hastings, gave way to their sons and grandsons. The England they had conquered slowly became the England they belonged to. The Norman language they brought with them evolved into the Anglo-Norman dialect that would eventually give way to Middle English. The customs they had imported from Normandy mingled with English traditions to produce something new, but the family remained, persistent, landed, visible in the records of English governance century after century. It was into this family, into this world, into the comfortable security of a Norman house that had been English for a century and more, that Ida de Tosny was born, most likely somewhere between 1150 and 1160, though the precise year of her birth was never recorded in any document that has survived. She was named, as we have noted, after her paternal grandmother, Ida de Hainaut, a woman of the Flemish nobility who had married an earlier generation of the Tosny lords. To give a child their grandmother's name was a deliberate act of continuity, a way of linking the new generation to the old, of saying that this child was part of a story that had been unfolding for a long time and would continue to unfold after she was gone. Her father was Ralph de Tosny, the Lord of Flamstead, the head of the family's English branch, a man who appears in the documents of the mid-12th century as a figure of some regional significance. He is listed in some sources as Ralph Thur, Dasolfes, and in others as Ralph V, the discrepancy arising from how one numbers the Ralphs who preceded him in the Tosny line. The numbering matters less than the man. He was Lord of Flamstead, and Flamstead was his world. Ida's mother was a woman of distinguished lineage. Margaret de Beaumont, as she is recorded in the historical sources, was the daughter of Robert de Beaumont, 2nd Earl of Leicester. The Beaumonts were one of the great families of Anglo-Norman England, and the Earls of Leicester were men of genuine consequence at the royal court. To have a Beaumont for a mother was to enter the world with significant social capital already in one's possession, with connections to the highest levels of the aristocracy, with a name that opened doors, with the kind of lineage that made one instantly recognizable to the sorting mechanisms of medieval society. The marriage between Ralph de Tosny and Margaret de Beaumont had taken place sometime after 1155, though the precise date is not recorded. The sources that mention the marriage, principally the detailed genealogical research in the Foundation for Medieval Genealogy's work on English nobility, make clear that it was a match appropriate to both families' standing, the kind of alliance that Norman families made when they wished to strengthen their connections to the broader network of Anglo-Norman aristocracy. Ida was born in the years following this marriage, growing up in the household at Flamstead, with whatever siblings she had. The records are insufficient to give us a clear picture of the family's complete composition. She would have been raised in the manner appropriate to a noblewoman of her background, educated in the basics of reading and religious practice, trained in the management of a household, taught the rituals of courtly behavior that distinguished the aristocracy from those beneath them. Her childhood would have been structured by the rhythms of the church calendar, the great feasts and fasts that marked the turning of the year, and by the domestic rhythms of a large Anglo-Norman household. We know she grew up at Flamstead because the historical sources explicitly record that she was born and raised there. Despite her Norman ancestry, she was an English girl, or at least a girl of England, who happened to come from a Norman family. That combination was, by the mid-12th century, entirely normal. The conquest had been a century old. The Normans were Anglo-Normans now, as English as they were French, and the children of Flamstead were children of Hertfordshire, whatever their family's origins on the other side of the Channel. And then, in 1162, when Ida was still a young child, perhaps as young as 2 or 3, perhaps as old as 10 or 12, depending on which birth year estimate one accepts, her father died. Robert of Torigny, one of the most careful chroniclers of the mid-12th century, an abbot of Mont Saint-Michel, records the death of Rodolphus de Thounes in the year 1162. It is a brief entry, a single line in the larger tapestry of his chronicle, but it marks a moment that changed Ida's life entirely. Her father was gone, the Lord of Flamstead was dead, and Ida, along with the estates and the question of what happened next, passed into the hands of the crown. In the England of the 12th century, the death of a nobleman who held his lands directly from the king, a tenant-in-chief, in the legal language of the age, triggered a series of consequences that could reshape the lives of everyone connected to him. For the great lords of England, death was not merely a personal event. It was a legal and political one, involving the crown, the nobility, and the complex machinery of feudal obligation that governed the transfer of land and loyalty from one generation to the next. Among the most significant of these consequences, when the heir was a minor, was the institution of wardship. Wardship was not an invention of the Norman kings. It had roots in the feudal customs of the continent, but in England after the conquest, it was systematized and codified in ways that made it one of the most powerful tools available to the crown. The logic of wardship was rooted in the nature of feudal tenure. A man held his lands from the king on the understanding that he would provide military service, knights, equipment, and personal presence when the king required it. If that man died leaving a minor heir, the heir was obviously unable to fulfill this obligation. The king, as the ultimate landlord, therefore took control of the heir's lands and revenues until the heir came of age, at 21 for men, at the time of marriage for women, and could assume the obligations that came with the inheritance. In practice, this meant that the crown, or whoever the king appointed as guardian, administered the ward's estates and collected their revenues throughout the wardship period. This was enormously profitable. The wardship of a wealthy orphan was a prize that kings and great nobles competed for, because the revenues of a great estate, collected for years without any obligation to return them, represented a significant financial windfall. For female wards, the institution of wardship had an additional dimension that was, in many ways, even more significant than the control of land. A female ward's marriage, the single most important legal and social event of a medieval woman's life, was entirely at the guardian's disposal. No marriage could take place without the guardian's consent, and the guardian had the right to arrange the marriage as he saw fit, taking into account the political and financial advantages to himself, as well as any consideration of the ward's own preferences or well-being. The law attempted, in theory, to protect wards from the worst abuses of this system. There were provisions against marrying a ward to someone beneath her station, or against forcing a marriage that the ward actively objected to. But these protections were modest at best, and the power differential between a king or great lord and a young orphan girl was so enormous that any theoretical protection was of limited practical value. For Ida de Tosny, the death of her father in 1162 meant that she, along with her mother Margaret and whatever siblings she had, passed into the guardianship of King Henry II. Her father's lands were now administered by the crown. Her future marriage was now the king's to arrange. Her very body, where she lived, who she saw, what future was chosen for her, was under royal control in a way that was absolute and unquestioned by the legal norms of the age. She was not, by any means, the first ward to find herself in this position. The institution of wardship had been operating since the conquest, and there had been many women before Ida who had passed through the machinery of royal guardianship with greater or lesser difficulty. Some had been treated well, placed in comfortable households, given appropriate education, married to men of suitable standing. Others had been treated less well, their wardships sold to the highest bidder, their marriages arranged for the guardian's profit without any regard for their own interests. What was known, and what the historical sources note explicitly, was that Ida was not the first royal ward to be taken as a royal mistress. The practice had precedent. Isabel de Beaumont, ward of Henry III, had become the mistress of one of his sons. The vulnerability of young women placed entirely within the power of a royal guardian was not a secret or a surprise. It was simply the reality of the system. We do not know when Ida arrived at the royal court. We do not know whether her mother Margaret accompanied her, or whether Ida was placed in a specific household. The mechanics of individual wardships varied considerably depending on the circumstances, and the historical record for Ida's specific case gives us almost nothing. She existed as a ward of the crown from 1162 onward. She moved at some point into the orbit of Henry II's court, and everything that followed grew from that proximity. The royal court of Henry II was, in the 1160s and 1170s, one of the most remarkable places in Europe. It was simultaneously a centre of governance, the engine room of the English state, where laws were made and disputes adjudicated, and the machinery of royal administration was maintained, and a centre of culture, where some of the finest minds and most accomplished artists of the age gathered under royal patronage. Henry himself was a man of extraordinary intellectual energy. He could read and write in several languages, including Latin, French, and probably English. He was interested in law and theology and history. He surrounded himself with scholars, men like Peter of Blois, who served as one of his secretaries and left behind a body of correspondence that gives us one of our most vivid pictures of the 12th century court. He was also, in his personal habits, a man of restless physical energy, a hunter, a rider, a man who kept his court moving from place to place across his vast domains with a speed that exhausted those around him. Into this world came Ida de Tosny, young, Norman, the daughter of a good family, the ward of the most powerful man in England. What happened next was shaped by all of these facts simultaneously. Before we can fully understand what Ida's years at the royal court meant, before we can understand the relationship she formed with the king, and what it cost her and what it gave her, we need to understand Henry II himself, because Henry was not merely Ida's guardian, and later her lover. He was the defining presence of her formative years, the man whose world she inhabited, whose court she served, and whose son she bore. Henry II came to the throne of England in December 1154, at the age of 21, bringing with him not just the crown of England, but the enormous continental holdings that made him the master of what historians would later call the Angevin Empire. England itself was the core, the island kingdom that had been his great-grandfather's conquest, and that now, after 2 decades of civil war between his mother, Empress Matilda, and King Stephen, was hungry for peace and good government. But Henry was also Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and through his recent marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, the ruler of a duchy that stretched from the Loire to the Pyrenees. No English king before or since has controlled as much of France, from the Scottish border to the edge of Spain. Henry's dominions stretched in an unbroken arc that made him, in territorial terms, more powerful than the King of France himself. It was a remarkable position, and Henry was fully aware of it. He intended to use it, to build on it, and to pass it intact to his sons. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, an overwhelming physical and intellectual presence, of medium height, with reddish hair and a stocky, powerful build. He had the kind of energy that contemporaries described with a mixture of admiration and exhaustion. He never seemed to sit still. He was always moving, always hunting, always holding court in some distant corner of his empire. He ate standing up, they said, because he could not bear to waste the time that sitting would require. He wore out his horses and wore out his courtiers, and he seemed to find the whole business of governing an enormous empire genuinely enjoyable in a way that more reflective men might not have. His intelligence was real and formidable. He was one of the great legal reformers of English history, the man who, more than any other individual, created the common law system that still forms the foundation of the legal tradition in England and many of its former colonies. He reorganized the courts, systematized the process by which disputes were resolved, and reduced the power of the church courts in ways that were simultaneously necessary and enormously controversial. That controversy, the conflict between royal authority and clerical privilege, brought him into the most celebrated confrontation of his reign, the dispute with Thomas Becket. Becket had been Henry's chancellor, his closest friend, the man he had elevated to the Archbishopric of Canterbury, in the expectation that a friendly archbishop would smooth the path of royal legal reform. Instead, Becket took the role of archbishop seriously, became a genuine defender of church privilege, and fought Henry's legal reforms with a stubborn conviction that infuriated his former patron. The conflict lasted for years, punctuated by periods of reconciliation and renewed hostility. It ended in the most dramatic and shocking way possible. In December 1170, 4 of Henry's knights, responding to the king's famous outburst of frustration, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" rode to Canterbury Cathedral and murdered Becket at the altar. The murder of an archbishop in his own cathedral sent shockwaves through the Christian world. Henry was forced into a public penance, walking barefoot to Becket's tomb while monks flogged him. Becket was canonized within 3 years of his death and became one of the most popular saints in England. Henry recovered from this crisis politically, but the shadow of Becket's murder never entirely left his reign, and it was in the years following the murder, in the early to mid-1170s, that Henry's personal life entered one of its most turbulent periods. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, which had begun as a partnership of remarkable equals, was by this point in serious difficulty. Eleanor was not a woman who accepted a subordinate role easily. She had been Queen of France before she was Queen of England. She had governed vast territories. She had participated in a crusade. She had, by almost any measure, more political experience and personal authority than most men of her age. But as Henry's reign progressed, he accumulated more power, and she had less and less influence over how that power was exercised. His affairs, the relationships with other women that began even in the early years of the marriage, were a source of tension, though Eleanor seems to have accommodated them with relative equanimity for many years. The breaking point came not over an affair, but over politics. In 1173, Henry's sons, led by the young King Henry, who had been crowned as his father's junior partner in 1170, but given no real authority to match the title, rose in open rebellion. Eleanor appears to have encouraged them, or at least not discouraged them, and she was caught attempting to leave Henry's domains disguised as a man, or so later accounts suggest, in order to join her son's cause at the French court. Henry captured her, and he imprisoned her. Eleanor of Aquitaine spent the next 15 years confined in various royal residences, comfortable enough by the standards of medieval imprisonment, but stripped of the political freedom and independent authority she had previously enjoyed. She would not be fully released until Henry's death in 1189. The Great Rebellion, as historians call the events of 1173 to 1174, was eventually crushed. Henry defeated his sons and their allies, including significantly Hugh Bigod, 1st Earl of Norfolk, who would prove relevant to Ida's story in ways that will become clear. The rebellion left marks on Henry's reign and on his personality. He was less trusting after it. His relationship with his sons was permanently damaged, and the royal court, already a place of considerable complexity, became something darker and more vigilant in the years that followed. It was into this world, this court, this king, this atmosphere of political tension and personal turbulence that Ida de Tosny was embedded. As a young ward, she would have been largely insulated from the worst of the political storms, but she could not have been unaware of them. The murder of Becket, the Great Rebellion, Eleanor's imprisonment. These were not background events. They were the defining drama of the age, and they played out directly around her. And it was in the years following the Great Rebellion, when Henry was at last in full control of his kingdom, when Eleanor was safely imprisoned, when the immediate political crisis had passed, that his relationship with Ida became what it became. To understand Ida's position at Henry's court, we need to understand something about the broader landscape of royal relationships in the 12th century, and specifically about the woman who came before her in Henry's affections, whose story would later be confused with Ida's own. Rosamund Clifford was, by every account, one of the most beautiful women of her generation. She was the daughter of Walter de Clifford, a Marcher lord whose family took its name from Clifford Castle on the River Wye, and his wife Margaret de Tosney. That maternal family name, de Tosney, is the first thread connecting Rosamund to Ida, a connection we will examine more closely in a later chapter. Rosamund grew up at Clifford Castle, on the troubled border between England and Wales, and received her education at Godstow Abbey near Oxford, where the nuns of the Benedictine community would have given her the basic literacy and devotional training appropriate to a girl of her social class. She was, by the time Henry II encountered her, a young woman of good family, not one of the great magnate families, but respectable, connected, presentable at court. The relationship between Henry and Rosamund appears to have begun around 1166, during or after one of Henry's campaigns against the Welsh ruler Rhys ap Gruffydd. The king was moving through the marches, and Clifford Castle was in his path, and Rosamund was there. What happened between them in the first instance, we cannot know. What we know is that by the late 1160s, Rosamund had become the king's acknowledged mistress, and by 1174, when the relationship became common knowledge following the Great Rebellion, she was famous enough to attract the attentions of chroniclers. Henry loved her, as much as a man of his restless and complicated nature could be said to love anyone. He provided for her lavishly. He supported Godstow Abbey as an act of piety connected to Rosamund's earlier education there. And when Rosamund, perhaps ill, perhaps exhausted by the pressures of a life lived as a royal mistress, retired to Godstow around 1176 and died there within a short time of her arrival, Henry paid for her tomb and for an endowment that would ensure the nuns kept it in order. The tomb became famous. Local people left candles and flowers. The legend of the fair Rosamund, the beautiful woman hidden in a bower at Woodstock, the jealous queen who poisoned her, the labyrinth in the garden, the tragic death of England's great beauty, grew around the simple facts of a woman's life and death, until the legend was almost entirely detached from the reality. None of the dramatic elements of the later story, the bower, the labyrinth, the poison, the queen's jealousy, appear in contemporary sources. They accumulated over centuries, as legends do, each generation adding its own embroidery to the basic outline. What is relevant to Ida's story is this. Rosamund Clifford's relationship with Henry appears to have lasted roughly from 1166 to 1176, with a public dimension from around 1174. She died around 1176, and she bore Henry no confirmed children, despite later traditions that tried to attribute various of his bastards to her. Into the space that Rosamund's death left, or perhaps even slightly before her death, in the final years of the relationship, Ida de Tosney entered. The world of royal mistresses in 12th century England was not what modern imagination tends to make it. These were not glamorous, powerful, officially acknowledged figures in the manner of later centuries, the kind of recognized royal favorite who openly wielded political influence and was received at court with formal respect. Henry's England did not work that way. A royal mistress was someone whose connection to the king was understood and perhaps discussed, but not officially acknowledged in any formal ceremony or document. She occupied a position that was simultaneously privileged and precarious, closer to the king than almost any other woman, but without legal standing, without formal title, without the protections that a wife's position conferred. For a young woman of Ida's background, good family, but no independent wealth or political power of her own, entirely subject to the king's guardianship, the relationship with the king was not something she could easily refuse or avoid. The power differential was absolute. Henry was her guardian. He controlled her lands, her revenues, and her future marriage. The social and legal norms of the age offered her almost no protection against his attention if he chose to direct it toward her. This is not to say that all relationships between kings and their wards were coercive in any simple sense. Medieval people had complex understandings of consent and compulsion that do not map perfectly onto modern frameworks. Some royal wards appeared to have formed genuine attachments to their guardians or to men their guardians chose for them. The historical record is not detailed enough, in most cases, to tell us what the woman herself felt about the circumstances she was in. For Ida, specifically, we know nothing of her inner life on this question. The sources are silent. We know she bore the king's son. We know she was subsequently given in marriage to another man. We know her son, decades later, named her in a document with the simple title, My Mother. Beyond these facts, we have only the power structures of the age and the behavior of the man at the center of those structures. The transition from royal ward to royal mistress, whatever form it took, however it was managed, placed Ida in a position that was, by the standards of her time and world, not without precedent, but certainly not ordinary. Henry II was not a king who confined himself to one woman. His marriage to Eleanor had produced 8 children. His affairs had produced others. Geoffrey, who would become Archbishop of York, and one of the more prominent ecclesiastical figures of the late 12th century, was another of Henry's acknowledged bastards, born to a woman named Iceni, who appears in the chronicles as a figure of low social status and disappears again almost immediately. There were probably other children, other relationships, less well documented or less well acknowledged. Ida's relationship with Henry was different from these others in at least one significant respect. It produced a child who mattered. William Longspay, Ida's son by the king, grew up to be acknowledged by Henry, granted land, and eventually elevated through marriage to one of the great earldoms of England. He was not merely an obscure royal bastard who appeared in a document or two and then faded from the record. He was a genuine historical figure, and his career can be followed in considerable detail through the reigns of Richard III, John, and the early years of Henry III. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. At the time of William's birth, whatever that time was, whether the late 1160s or the mid-1170s, he was simply a baby, born to a young woman who had no formal standing at court beyond her connection to the king. The question of where Ida lived, how she was provided for, and what her daily life looked like during the years of her relationship with Henry is one that the historical record cannot fully answer. Royal mistresses of this period were not provided with official residences or formal establishments in the way that, say, a royal mistress of the Tudor period might be. They were accommodated within the existing structures of the royal court or within the households of members of the nobility connected to the king. They received gifts and support, lands, money, provisions, but these were informal arrangements rather than legally recognized entitlements. What we can reconstruct very imperfectly is something of the atmosphere in which Ida moved during these years. The royal court in the late 1160s and through the 1170s was a place of extraordinary complexity. The relationship between Henry and Eleanor was deteriorating. The quarrel with Becket, ended by murder in 1170, cast a shadow over everything. The Great Rebellion of 1173 to 1174 brought the conflicts within the royal family to their most acute and dramatic expression. Through all of this, the ordinary business of the court continued: the hearing of petitions, the management of estates, the reception of ambassadors, the constant movement from palace to palace that characterized Henry's restless style of governance. Ida moved through all of this as a presence without a voice in the record. She was there, the mother of the king's son, a woman connected to him by the most intimate relationship a man and woman could have, embedded in the court that revolved around him. But she left no letters, no chronicle accounts, no direct trace of herself beyond the fact of her son's existence. There is something quietly remarkable about this. She was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the women closest to the most powerful man in Europe during this period, and yet she is more invisible in the contemporary record than almost anyone else in that court. The chroniclers who recorded the deeds of Henry's knights and the speeches of his bishops and the movements of his armies had nothing to say about the woman who bore his son. This was not unusual. Medieval chroniclers, almost universally male, almost universally ecclesiastical in background, wrote about what they considered worth writing about: wars, legal disputes, ecclesiastical controversies, the deeds of great men. Women who did not enter the narrative through one of the prescribed roles, queen, abbess, saint, rebel, tended not to enter it at all. A royal mistress, however close to the king, was not a category that medieval chroniclers felt bound to record in detail. Somewhere in the years between the late 1160s and the mid-1170s, the uncertainty of the date remaining one of the persistent gaps in this story, Ida de Tosny gave birth to a son. She named him William, and in naming him William, she gave him a name that was common enough in the Norman world not to draw any particular attention, and yet specific enough to his father's family. Henry's father, Geoffrey Plantagenet, had a half-brother named William, that it may have carried meaning. The child grew up. We know almost nothing of William's childhood, where he was raised, who oversaw his education, how much contact he had with his father or his mother in the years of his growing. Royal bastards of this period were accommodated in various ways, depending on the king's interest and the available resources. Some were raised in the royal household itself. Others were placed with noble families who provided appropriate training. Still others were sent to monastic schools for a clerical education, particularly if the king envisaged an ecclesiastical career for them. William Longspay did not become a churchman. He became a knight, and then a great lord, and eventually one of the most prominent military commanders of his generation. Whatever education he received, it was oriented toward the martial life of the Anglo-Norman aristocracy: riding, combat, the management of estates, the politics of the Great Hall. Henry II acknowledged William as his son at some point. The formal acknowledgement came in 1188, when the king granted William the honour of Appleby in Lincolnshire, but the recognition of paternity was presumably established earlier than this formal grant. The honour of Appleby was a real estate with real revenues, not the greatest of England's noble inheritances, but a solid foundation on which a young man with royal blood and ambition could begin to build a career. The grant in 1188 tells us something important about Henry's attitude toward this particular bastard son. Of his acknowledged illegitimate children, William received the most direct and substantial royal support, more, certainly, than Geoffrey of York, who had to make his own way in the ecclesiastical world, and more than the other, more obscure bastards, whose names appear briefly in documents without the backing of significant royal grants. Henry apparently saw something in William, or felt some obligation toward Ida, that translated into a meaningful practical provision. We cannot know what motivated this particular degree of royal attention. Perhaps William had simply proven himself capable in the years since his adolescence, demonstrating the qualities that would later make him a celebrated military commander. Perhaps Henry felt a degree of affection for Ida that expressed itself in unusual generosity toward her son. Perhaps it was simply political calculation. A royal bastard who was also a capable and loyal supporter was useful, and making him useful required giving him the resources to function effectively. Whatever the reason, the grant of 1188 set William on a path that would lead him to one of the great careers of his generation. And when Henry died in July 1189, worn out by the final rebellion of his sons, the shame of defeat at Le Mans and Chillon, the revelation that even his favourite son John had turned against him, William had a foundation from which to approach the new reign. Richard I, who succeeded his father, was a different kind of king from Henry, where Henry was a builder of institutions, of legal systems, of governance structures. Richard was a crusader, a warrior, a man whose entire political imagination was oriented toward the Holy Land and the recovery of Jerusalem. He spent barely 6 months of his 10-year reign in England, but he was not unaware of the political realities of English governance, and he was not indifferent to the claims of family loyalty. Richard arranged, among other things, a marriage for his bastard half-brother. The match he chose for William Longspay was one of the great heiresses of England. Ella of Salisbury was, in the year 1196, one of the most eligible heiresses in England. She was the only child of William Fitzpatrick, 2nd Earl of Salisbury, and Eleanor de Vitray. Her father, who had served at Richard I's coronation, and had been one of the 4 earls who supported the canopy of state at the king's second coronation in 1194, died in 1196, leaving Ella as his sole heir. Through her father, she was entitled to the earldom of Salisbury and to the extensive lands that went with it, a great estate spread across Wiltshire and beyond. She was also, at the time of the marriage, approximately 9 to 11 years old. This was not unusual by the standards of the 12th century, when strategic marriages were arranged for children who would not consummate the union until they were older. But it does underscore how thoroughly medieval marriage was a political institution rather than a personal one. Ella had no meaningful voice in the choice of her husband. Richard chose William Longspay, his bastard half-brother, as the man who would protect and manage the Salisbury inheritance, and who would, through the marriage, become one of the great earls of England. Through his marriage to Ela, William became the 3rd Earl of Salisbury jure uxoris, by right of his wife, as the medieval lawyers described the arrangement. He was not born to the earldom. He had married into it, but the title and the estates were real, and William would spend the rest of his life building on the foundation that this extraordinary marriage provided. For Ida, watching from wherever she was, perhaps still at the royal court, perhaps already established in the household that would become her life after 1181, this must have been a remarkable thing to observe. The son she had borne in the shadows of the king's court had grown into a man who was now an Earl of England, married to one of the greatest heiresses in the kingdom, his royal blood translated into real nobility through the mechanism of a marriage arranged by the king, who was his half-brother. We do not know whether Ida attended William's wedding. We do not know whether she and her son maintained contact through the years of his rise. We do not know, with any certainty, whether she was proud of what he had become, or whether the circumstances of his birth and her subsequent marriage, the life she had built in Norfolk with Roger Bigod, the children she had borne him, the distance in miles and social position between Framlingham and the earldom of Salisbury, created a gap between mother and son that was simply too wide to bridge. What we know is that William remembered her. He said so in the charters he gave to Bradenstoke Priory, in the 5 Latin words that would eventually restore her name to history. We have spoken already of the political circumstances that led to Ida's marriage to Roger Bigod in December of 1181. But it is worth pausing to examine this moment more carefully, because it is the defining transition of Ida's adult life, the moment when she passed from one world to another, from the king's court to the earl's castle, from mistress to countess. The background to the marriage was, as we have noted, deeply political. Roger Bigod was the son of Hugh Bigod, 1st Earl of Norfolk, a man who had been one of the most troublesome barons of Henry II's reign. Hugh had participated in the Great Rebellion of 1173 to 1174, backing the king's rebellious sons against their father. He had been defeated and had submitted, but the damage to his relationship with the king was permanent. When Hugh died in 1177, reportedly in Palestine, though the chronology suggests the death may actually have occurred in 1176, with news reaching England in early 1177. His relationship with Henry was in a state of mutual wariness at best. Henry, who never missed an opportunity to exploit a baronial inheritance dispute, moved with calculated precision. Roger, Hugh's eldest son by his first wife Juliana de Vere, was the obvious heir to the earldom of Norfolk, but Hugh had also had a second wife, Gundreda de Beaumont, who had borne him 2 more sons. Gundreda, after her husband's death, sought to secure a portion of the Bigod inheritance for these sons, at Roger's expense. The dispute over the manors of Acle, Halvergate, and South Walsham, 3 substantial properties in Norfolk, was at the centre of this contest. Henry, still nursing a grudge against the Bigod family for their role in the rebellion, deliberately chose not to resolve the dispute. He left the case technically unresolved, refused to confirm Roger as Earl of Norfolk, and confiscated the disputed manors, holding them in royal hands while the legal situation remained formally open. This was classic Angevin statecraft. Use an inheritance dispute as a lever of political control, keeping a potentially troublesome vassal in a state of dependent uncertainty, withholding the confirmation that would allow him to function as a fully independent great lord. Roger spent years in this limbo, with an earl's title in theory, without an earl's resources and formal recognition in practice. By 1181, Henry was ready to resolve the situation, and he did so in the most efficient way possible, by tying the resolution of the Bigod inheritance dispute to the marriage of the woman whose future he controlled. Around Christmas of 1181, Henry arranged the marriage of Ida de Tosny to Roger Bigod, and with Ida as her marriage portion, the practical consideration that made the match financially meaningful, Henry restored to Roger the 3 manors of Acle, Halvergate, and South Walsham. The arrangement was elegant in its efficiency. Henry disposed of a woman who had served as his mistress, providing for her future in a manner appropriate to her status. He used the marriage to simultaneously resolve a political problem that had been simmering for years. Roger received his manors. Ida received a husband and a title. Henry demonstrated his absolute control over the fates of everyone in his orbit. But Henry did not give Roger everything. Despite the marriage and the restored manors, he still withheld formal confirmation of Roger's earldom. Roger Bigod would not become the undisputed Earl of Norfolk until Richard the Fern came to the throne in 1189 and confirmed the earldom as one of his first acts of governance. For 8 more years after his marriage to Ida, Roger lived in the odd liminal space between a recognized nobleman and a confirmed earl. The Magna Carta Trust's account of Roger Bigod's career notes something additional that is worth recording here. Henry's grudge against the Bigod family, rooted in Hugh's participation in the Great Rebellion, expressed itself not just in the withholding of the earldom, but in a more general pattern of deliberate disadvantage, leaving the case unresolved, savouring the opportunity to remind this family that they had sided against him and that he had not forgotten. Roger's marriage to Ida was, in this reading, not just an act of provision for Ida or a gesture of resolution toward the bigods. It was also a final expression of Henry's control, giving Roger something with one hand while withholding something more significant with the other. What did Roger Bigod make of this marriage? He was a man in his late 30s, mature and politically experienced, who had spent years managing the complicated aftermath of his father's legacy. He knew how the game was played. He understood that the king's gift was also the king's demonstration of power. And he understood, presumably, something about Ida's history, that she had been the king's ward, that she had been close to the king in ways that went beyond the purely administrative relationship of guardian and ward, that her son William was Henry's acknowledged bastard. Whether this knowledge was a source of pride or discomfort or simple pragmatic acceptance, we cannot say. The historical record is silent on Roger's feelings about his wife's background. What it tells us is that he married her and that he was evidently willing, or at least sufficiently pragmatic, to build a life with her. What did Ida feel? She too is silent in the record. She had lived for years in the king's orbit, bearing his son, dependent on his favour and goodwill. Now she was being passed to another man, in another county, in a world that was geographically and socially distant from the Plantagenet court she had known. Whether she was relieved or saddened, or simply resigned to the inevitable transfer of one woman's fate from one powerful man's hands to another's, we do not know. What we know is that within a year of the marriage, she was pregnant with Roger's child. The marriage, whatever its emotional texture, was a functioning one from the very beginning. The castle of Framlingham stands today in the quiet Suffolk countryside, much as it stood in Ida's time. Or rather, its outer walls and towers stand much as they were raised in the years around 1190 to 1210, when Roger Bigod undertook the great rebuilding project that transformed an older fortification into one of the finest baronial castles in England. Framlingham had been a Bigod stronghold since the family first established itself in East Anglia. The earliest castle on the site dated from the early 12th century, a relatively modest fortification by the standards of the later rebuilding. But the castle that most people think of when they think of Framlingham, the one with the great curtain wall punctuated by 13 square towers, the one whose remains attract visitors today, was largely the product of the period of Roger and Ida's marriage. The timing is interesting. Roger began the substantial rebuilding of Framlingham in the years around 1190, after Richard III confirmed his earldom and his position was finally secure. The castle he built was not merely a defensive structure, it was a statement. It said that the Bigods were a great family, that they had resources and ambition, that they intended to remain at the centre of East Anglian power for generations to come. The great curtain wall, without the mural towers that were still a relative novelty in English castle design at this date, was a design of impressive boldness, a castle that looked outward, confident, not defensive in the cowering sense, but powerful in the projecting sense. Ida lived in this castle, or in the process of its construction and completion. She was there as the towers rose. She was there as the great hall within the walls was furnished and staffed. She was there as the Bigod household took on the character and routine that it would maintain for decades. Life at Framlingham for a countess of Ida's status was structured and purposeful. The management of a great baronial household was, as we have noted, a genuinely complex administrative task. The Bigod estate stretched across East Anglia, in Norfolk, in Suffolk, in other counties besides. Managing these estates required oversight of agricultural production on multiple manors. supervision of the officials who collected rents and managed the day-to-day operations of each property, coordination of supplies and provisions for the castle itself, reception and entertainment of the constant stream of visitors, from local knights paying their obligations to great lords passing through on their way to somewhere else, and the management of a household staff that might number in the hundreds. Ida would also have been responsible for the religious life of the household, the maintenance of the chapel, the relationship with local monasteries and priories, the almsgiving and charitable obligations that were part of a great family's social role. The Bigod family had connections with several religious houses in East Anglia, and the Countess's role in maintaining these connections was both practical and devotional. And she bore children. The children she bore Roger Bigod over the years of their marriage form a roster that tells us something about the vitality of their union and the expectations of their class. Hugh, the eldest, born around 1182. William, Roger, John, Ralph, sons who would grow up to serve the family's interests in various ways. Mary, who would marry Ralph Fitzrobert. Marjorie, who would marry William de Hastings. Ida, the youngest daughter, named after her mother in that same act of naming continuity that had named Ida herself after her grandmother. At least 8 children, perhaps more. The records may not preserve every birth, particularly of children who died young, as many medieval children did. 8 confirmed children, born over a period of perhaps 15 to 20 years, in the rhythms of the medieval noblewomen's life that alternated pregnancy with nursing, and nursing with pregnancy, in a cycle that was physically demanding even for women of privilege. What was it like to live this life? To move from the royal court, from the proximity to power, the glamour, the danger, the connection to the most important man in Europe, to the more circumscribed world of a Suffolk castle, the management of estates, the raising of children. We cannot know. The question is unanswerable with the evidence we have, but it is worth asking, because behind the facts of births and deaths and marriages and grants, there is a life, a woman's life, full of experience and perception and feeling that the historical record has chosen not to preserve. What we can say is that Ida's marriage to Roger Bigod produced, by the external evidence of its fruits, a stable and functioning partnership. They built a dynasty together. They raised children who became significant figures in 13th century England, and they apparently lived in sufficient harmony to maintain, across decades, a household that was a serious political and social force in East Anglian life. While Ida was building the life of Framlingham, Roger Bigod was building his political career in the wider world of English governance, and that career, in its trajectory and its ultimate significance, tells us a great deal about the world Ida inhabited as his wife. After Richard I confirmed Roger's earldom in 1189, Roger became one of the prominent figures of East Anglian baronage. He served as a royal justiciar, one of the officials who administered royal justice in the king's absence, and he participated in the negotiations for Richard's release from captivity when the king was held by the Holy Roman Emperor Henry II. After being captured on his return from the Third Crusade, he inherited from his father the traditional office of royal steward, a ceremonial but symbolically significant position in the royal household. Through the reign of John, who succeeded Richard in 1199, Roger navigated the treacherous politics of one of the most difficult reigns in English history. John was not a king who inspired loyalty or trust. He was suspicious, erratic, financially rapacious, and prone to the kind of arbitrary exercise of power that alienated precisely the barons he needed on his side. Roger, like many of the great magnates of the age, moved carefully through John's reign, maintaining his position, preserving his estates, and watching with increasing alarm as the king's governance deteriorated. By 1215, the crisis had come to a head. John's endless financial demands, the scutages and reliefs, and other exactions by which he extracted money from his barons in violation of what they understood to be their feudal rights, combined with his military failures in France and his general pattern of arbitrary and unpredictable behaviour, had pushed the English baronage to the edge of open rebellion. The baronial confrontation with John resulted in Magna Carta, the Great Charter, sealed at Runnymede in June 1215. It was a document that attempted to codify the limits of royal power in concrete terms, to establish that the king was bound by law, that he could not simply take from his barons what he pleased, that there were procedures and protections that even the most powerful man in England was obliged to respect. Roger Bigod was among the 25 barons who put their names to Magna Carta as its guarantors, the men who were charged under the Charter's terms with ensuring that John actually adhered to its provisions. His son Hugh was also among them. Mother and son, Ida and Hugh, were both, through their menfolk, connected to one of the most significant constitutional moments in English history. The irony is vivid. Ida herself had spent years living entirely within the absolute power of a king. She had been his ward, subject to his control without recourse or appeal. She had been his mistress in circumstances that made meaningful resistance almost impossible. She had been given in marriage at his direction, with 3 manors as her price, and now her husband and her son were among the men who forced a king to acknowledge that his power had limits. John, of course, had no intention of honouring the charter. He appealed to the Pope, who annulled it. The barons, seeing John's bad faith, invited the French Prince Louis to England, and Louis landed in May 1216, sweeping through the south with alarming speed. Roger and Hugh Bigod, excommunicated by the Pope for their role in the baronial revolt, found themselves on the wrong side of both the king and Rome before the crisis was over. Roger was in his 70s by this point, old by any medieval standard, remarkable by the standards of his own time, but he was still active, still politically engaged, still managing his affairs with the pragmatic skill that had characterized his long career. He made his peace with the regency government of Henry III in 1217, after Louis's cause had collapsed and the young king's regents had reasserted royal authority. And in 1221, the old man died, with his lands intact, his family secure, the Bigod dynasty established as one of the great forces in East Anglian life. In 1979, in the archives of the Wiltshire Record Society, something remarkable happened. The Wiltshire Record Society had been working for several years on the publication of the cartulary of Bradenstoke Priory. Bradenstoke Priory was a house of Augustinian canons founded in the 12th century in Wiltshire, a modest religious community that had accumulated, over its centuries of existence, a collection of documents relating to its properties, its benefactors, and its legal affairs. When the priory was dissolved during the Reformation in the 16th century, these documents passed eventually into archival collections, and in 1979 they were edited and published by Vera C. M. London as Volume 35 of the Wiltshire Record Society's publications. Within the collection were 2 charters issued by William Longaspey, 3rd Earl of Salisbury. The charters were grants of various kinds to the priory, the kind of document that noble benefactors regularly produced for religious houses they supported, providing land or money in exchange for prayers and masses for the souls of themselves and their families. And in those charters, William named his mother, Comitissa Ida Mater Mea, Countess Ida, my mother. The phrase is simple. It is not dramatic. It does not elaborate on who Countess Ida was, or what her relationship to William had been beyond the basic biological fact of maternity, or what he felt about her. It is simply a naming. the kind of naming that appeared in medieval documents when a benefactor wished to include a specific person in the prayers and commemorations that the religious house would perform. But those 5 words, Comitissa Ida Mater Mea, were a key that had been waiting for 8 centuries to be turned. They identified William Longespay's mother as a woman named Ida who held the title of Countess. They pointed toward a specific historical person who could, in theory, be identified from the documentary record. The identification was not immediate. The cartulary was published in 1979. The scholarly community took note of the references, and in 2002, 2 articles appeared in the American Genealogist, one of the most rigorous peer-reviewed journals devoted to genealogical scholarship, that together established the identification beyond reasonable doubt. Paul C. Reed's article, Countess Ida, mother of William Longespay, illegitimate son of Henry II, argued the case from the Bradenstoke evidence. Reed worked through the available countesses named Ida in the relevant period, eliminated those whose chronology or other circumstances made the identification impossible, and arrived at Ida de Tosney, the woman who had married Roger Bigod, 2nd Earl of Norfolk, in 1181, and who was thus Countess of Norfolk, which is what Comitissa Ida meant. Raymond W. Fair's companion article, William Longespay, Ralph Bigod, and Countess Ida, provided a crucial independent piece of evidence from an entirely different source. The Battle of Bouvines in 1214 had produced a prisoner roll, a list of the men taken captive on the English and Allied side after their disastrous defeat by Philip II of France. Among the prisoners was Ralph Bigod, one of the sons of Roger Bigod, and Ida de Tosney. And on that prisoner roll, the document recorded that Ralph Bigod was the brother, specifically the half-brother, of William, Earl of Salisbury. 2 independent pieces of documentary evidence, both pointing to the same conclusion. William Longespay's mother was the woman who had married Roger Bigod and had borne him the sons, including Ralph Bigod, who are recorded in the sources. The identification was complete. Ida de Tosney was William Longespay's mother. The long misattribution to Rosamond Clifford was at last laid definitively to rest. The late Charles Evans, one of the most respected genealogical researchers of his generation, commented approvingly on the 2 Bradenstoke Charter references in a letter to the genealogist in 1982, before the full scholarly confirmation of 2002. He noted that the editors of the cartulary had accepted the references as genuine, and he saw no reason to doubt them. The documents were not forgeries. They were not interpolations. They were genuine medieval charters that William Longespay had issued in his own lifetime, containing his own statement about his own mother. 8 centuries of misdirection ended with 5 words. Ida de Tosney, Countess and Mother, was found. To understand the full weight of what Ida gave the world by bearing William Longespay, it is worth following his career in some detail, because his achievements were, by any standard, extraordinary, and they speak to the capacities that Ida's son brought into the world. William came into his earldom by marrying Ella of Salisbury in 1196, through the decade of Richard II's reign, mostly spent on crusade or in French captivity. William built his position as a royal supporter and a capable administrator. He held various offices under Richard, establishing himself as one of the reliable men of the royal administration. When John came to the throne in 1199, William's position became more complex. John was his half-brother, both sons of Henry II, connected by blood if not by temperament. William's loyalty to John was genuine and long-lasting, even as the king's behaviour became increasingly difficult to defend. He served John in a remarkable variety of capacities, demonstrating the range of skills that marked him as an exceptionally versatile nobleman. As High Sheriff of Wiltshire, he administered royal justice in one of England's important counties. As Constable of Dover Castle, he held one of the most strategically vital fortresses in England, the key to the Channel crossing, the point at which any invasion from France would have to be addressed. As Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, he oversaw the naval towns of the southeast coast that formed England's primary maritime defence. As Lieutenant of Gascony, he represented the English crown in the remnant of the Angevin Empire that remained under English control in southwestern France. This was a career of remarkable breadth and energy, reflecting both William's genuine capabilities and the trust that John placed in him, a trust that was, by the standards of John's reign, unusual and significant. John trusted very few people. The fact that he trusted William enough to give him charge of Dover, of the Cinque Ports, of Gascony, says something important about what William had demonstrated in years of service. The Battle of Dam in 1213 was William's greatest hour. John, perpetually anxious about a French invasion, Philip II of France had assembled an enormous fleet at the Flemish port of Dam, near Bruges, in preparation for an assault on England, sent William with an English fleet to deal with the threat. The French fleet was caught at anchor in the harbour, many of its sailors on shore or foraging in the countryside. William attacked with decisive speed. He burned or captured hundreds of French ships and seized enormous quantities of supplies and equipment. The threat of a French invasion was extinguished, at least for the moment. It was a textbook naval raid. Quick, brutal, and spectacularly effective. It demonstrated exactly the qualities that made William valuable: the ability to act decisively, to exploit an opportunity when it presented itself, and to deliver a result that solved a strategic problem with efficiency. John was delighted. The English coast was safe, and William Longuespay's military reputation was established beyond question. The Battle of Bouvines in July 1214 was a different kind of event entirely, a comprehensive military disaster that was not William's fault, but that he experienced in full. John's plan to recover his French territories involved a two-pronged attack, his own forces approaching from the south, while Emperor Otto IV's forces, including English troops under William's command, attacked from the north. The Allied army was routed by Philip II's forces at Bouvines, one of the decisive battles of the age. William commanded the right wing of the Allied army. He fought with great personal courage. Contemporary accounts record his bravery and note that he saved his nephew Emperor Otto from capture or death. But individual courage could not overcome the collapse of the wider Allied force. William was struck by Philip of Dreux, Bishop of Beauvais, wielding a mace, the bishop's preferred weapon, one that crushed without cutting, preserving the technical clerical prohibition on shedding blood, and taken prisoner. The details are grimly specific. Knocked from his horse, captured by a French bishop with a mace, imprisoned in France for months while the political and military situation in England unravelled. When William was finally exchanged and returned to England, he found the country in open revolt. The barons had presented John with a list of demands. Magna Carta was, at this point, still a year away. On the prisoner roll from Bouvines, the document that would later serve as one of the two key pieces of evidence confirming Ida's identity, Ralph Bigod was listed as William's half-brother. Ralph was one of Ida's sons by Roger Bigod, fighting under William's command in France. In the chaos of the defeated Allied army, both the half-brothers had been captured by the French. Both were listed on the prisoner roll, and the document's casual notation of their relationship, half-brother, was the thread that, combined with William's own references to his mother in the Bradenstoke Charters, would eventually confirm who Ida was. William returned to England. He remained loyal to John through most of the baronial crisis, one of a small number of great magnates who chose the king's side when the barons were in revolt. He served John in the civil war that followed Magna Carta. He was present at John's death in October 1216, and when the child, Henry III, inherited the throne, and the Regency government began the long process of restoring royal authority, William was among the supporters of the young king. He went on campaign in Gascony in 1225, in the final year of his active life, trying to preserve the last remnants of the Angevin Empire in France. The campaign itself was unremarkable by his standards. The return voyage was not. His ship was caught in a terrible storm off the coast of Brittany. The crew feared they would founder. The ship survived but barely, and it limped into the shelter of the Ile de Ré, a small island off the French coast, where William and his companions spent months recovering and waiting for conditions that would allow them to cross the channel. He finally made it home, but the months of exposure, the hardship of the storm, and the long waiting had broken his health in ways that could not be repaired. William Longspay, 3rd Earl of Salisbury, returned to England a dying man. He made it to Salisbury Castle, his earldom's chief seat, and died there on the 7th of March, 1226. He was buried in Salisbury Cathedral. He was the first person ever interred in that magnificent building, a distinction that speaks to the love and respect in which he was held by the cathedral community and by the wider world of English nobility. His tomb, with its beautifully carved stone effigy of a knight in full armour, can still be seen there today in the cathedral's north nave aisle. The arms on his shield, 6 golden lions on a blue field, are the Longespay arms, derived from the arms of his grandfather Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, and worn by William throughout his life as a declaration of his royal ancestry. Matthew Paris, the celebrated 13th century chronicler and illustrator who recorded the events of Henry III's reign with meticulous care, drew William's arms and noted his career. He described the Earl's death with respect. He recorded his legacy. But he did not know who William's mother was. He would not have been surprised to learn that it was Ida de Tosny. One of the most intriguing threads in the whole tapestry of Ida's story is the relationship between Ida and Rosamund Clifford, the two women who were most closely associated with Henry II in the popular imagination, the one celebrated and the other forgotten, and the two who were connected by blood in ways that most tellings of either story fail to mention. The connection ran through the Tosny family. To understand it, we need to trace 2 branches of the same tree. Ida's branch was the direct Lord of Flamstead line. The Tosneys, who had settled at Flamstead after the conquest and continued there through successive generations. Her grandfather was Roger III de Tosny, and her great-grandfather was Raoul III de Tosny, the man who serves as the point at which Ida's line and Rosamund's line diverge. Rosamund's connection to the Tosneys came through her mother. Margaret de Tosny, Rosamund's mother, was the daughter of an earlier Ralph de Tosny of the Clifford branch of the family. She married Walter Fitzrichard, a Marcher lord who took the name de Clifford from his chief holding, Clifford Castle, on the River Wye. Through this marriage, Margaret de Tosny became the mother of Rosamund de Clifford. The mathematical result of this genealogy is that Raoul III de Tosny was Ida's great-grandfather and Rosamund's grandfather. By the calculations of medieval kinship, which tracked these things carefully because the Church's prohibitions on marriage within certain degrees of relationship required it, Ida and Rosamund were first cousins once removed. This is a fact that almost no account of either woman's story pauses to note, and yet it is extraordinary. Henry II's 2 most significant mistresses, the one celebrated in ballad and legend as the great love of his life, the other hidden for 8 centuries beneath the shadow of the first, were cousins. They came from the same Norman family. They were connected through a common ancestor who had helped conquer England a century before either of them was born. We do not know whether they knew each other. We do not know whether, in the world of the Plantagenet court, these two women of Tosney blood were ever in the same room. Rosamund's relationship with Henry appears to have been, at its most intense, in the late 1160s and early 1170s. Ida's relationship with Henry developed somewhat later, in the mid-1170s at the earliest, if we accept a birth date for William Longspay around 1176, or possibly as early as the late 1160s, if the earlier birth date estimate is correct. There may have been a period when both women were at court simultaneously, connected by blood, connected by their relationship to the king, unknown to each other, or perhaps very well known. The misattribution of William Longspay to Rosamund Clifford was the result of a kind of historical gravity, the pull of the famous name toward the most famous outcome. People knew that Rosamund was Henry's great love. They knew that William was Henry's acknowledged bastard. The connection seemed natural. Nobody looked more carefully, because the obvious answer seemed to be sufficient. But the obvious answer was wrong. William was Ida's son, not Rosamund's. The two women were cousins, not the same person. And Rosamund, for all the legend that surrounded her tomb at Godstow, left no children by the king, or none that the documentary record supports in any way. There is something poetically appropriate, in a dark sort of way, about the fact that the famous woman's story swallowed the less famous one. Rosamund Clifford was celebrated precisely because she had a story that people wanted to tell. A beauty, a king's passion, a mysterious death, a romantic legend. Ida de Tosney had a story that was harder to make into legend. A ward, a mistress, a political marriage, a life in a Suffolk castle. Not glamorous, not tragic in the operatic sense, simply the life of a woman who moved through one of history's great reigns without leaving behind the kind of dramatic trace that legends require, until her son, speaking quietly from an old document, told the truth. We must speak, before we close, about the silence that surrounds Ida de Tosney, because that silence is not accidental, and it is not merely the result of inadequate record-keeping. It is the product of a systematic pattern of historical exclusion that shaped which lives were recorded, and which were allowed to pass without notice. Medieval chronicles were written by men, with very few exceptions, notably the remarkable Christine de Pizan in France, a century and a half after Ida's death. The intellectual and documentary life of the medieval period was entirely male-dominated. The monks and clerks who wrote the chronicles, compiled the records, preserved the documents, were men who wrote about what they considered important: wars, legal disputes, ecclesiastical controversies, the deeds of kings and great lords. Women who entered the historical record did so through specific roles, as queens who bore heirs and governed in their husbands' absences, as abbesses who founded religious houses and managed large ecclesiastical estates, as saints whose virtue and miracles demanded commemoration, occasionally as rebels or figures of extraordinary personal drama, whose actions could not be ignored. Women who occupied these roles were recorded, sometimes in considerable detail, as Eleanor of Aquitaine was recorded, or as Empress Matilda was recorded, or as 100 abbesses and queens and occasional female rulers were recorded throughout the medieval period. Women who did not occupy these roles, women who lived in the margins of great events, who managed households and bore children, and participated in the social life of the aristocracy, without doing anything that a male chronicler would consider worth noting, tended to disappear from the record with quiet thoroughness. Ida de Tosney was one of these women. She was not a queen. She was not an abbess. She was not a rebel. She was a royal ward who became a royal mistress, and then a countess. A trajectory that was, for its circumstances, extraordinary, but that did not produce the kind of public drama that medieval chroniclers felt obligated to record. She lived her life at the intersection of some of the most important events in English medieval history, and the chroniclers who recorded those events looked straight through her. There is a broader truth here that extends beyond Ida's specific case. The women who have been recovered from the margins of medieval history through the patient work of genealogists and archivists and historians of women's lives represent only a fraction of those whose lives were worth knowing. For every Ida de Tosny who happens to be named in a document her son produced for a Wiltshire priory, there are 100 other women who left no such trace at all. Women who managed great estates, raised the children who grew up to be famous, participated in the religious life of their communities, and shaped the world around them in ways that no document preserves. The discovery of Ida's identity in the Bradenstoke cartulary is, in this sense, not just the recovery of one woman's story. It is a small illustration of what patient archival work can accomplish, of what is waiting to be found in the documents that have survived the centuries, if one knows to look for it and understands what one is seeing when it appears. Countess Ida, my mother. William Longespay wrote those words sometime in the early 13th century, intending them as a pious reference, a request for prayers, a placing of his mother's soul within the protective care of the Augustinian canons of Bradenstoke. He wrote them without any expectation that they would survive 800 years and eventually become the key to restoring his mother's identity to the historical record. He simply wrote what was true. History, in this case, was fortunate. We have spoken at length about William Longespay, the son Ida bore the king. But Ida's legacy was not confined to that one remarkable child. The 8 children she bore Roger Bigod formed a dynasty that shaped East Anglian aristocratic life for generations, and several of them made their own marks on the pages of English history. Hugh Bigod, Ida's eldest son by Roger, was born around 1182, within a year of his parents' Christmas 1181 marriage. He was, in many ways, the crucial figure in the continuation of the Bigod line. It was Hugh who would become the 3rd Earl of Norfolk when his father died in 1221, and who would hold the earldom for the 4 years until his own death in 1225. It was Hugh who, together with his father, stood among the 25 guarantors of Magna Carta in 1215, both of them excommunicated by the Pope for their role in the baronial revolt, both of them making peace with Henry III's regency in 1217. Hugh married Maud Marshall, the daughter of William Marshall, 1st Earl of Pembroke, one of the great figures of English medieval history, the knight described by contemporaries as the greatest knight in the world, the loyal servant of 4 English kings, the man whose biography, the Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal, is one of the most extraordinary portraits of medieval chivalry to survive. Maud Marshall's marriage to Hugh Bigod connected the Bigod family to the Marshall connection, and the Marshall connection, through the subsequent generation, to a web of aristocratic alliances that spread across England and beyond. The other sons, William, Roger, John, Ralph, were less prominent individually, but they were part of the Bigod household, participants in the family's political life, and connections to the broader network of East Anglian aristocracy that the family maintained. Ralph Bigod, as we have noted, served under his half-brother William Longespay at the Battle of Bouvines, and it was his presence on the prisoner roll, listed as the Earl of Salisbury's half-brother, that provided one of the 2 key pieces of evidence confirming Ida's identity. The daughters, Mary, Marjorie and Ida, married into other noble families, as daughters of great houses were expected to do. Mary married Ralph Fitzrobert. Marjorie married William de Hastings. Ida the younger, Ida's daughter, named after her mother, married into circumstances that the records do not preserve in the detail we would wish. All of these children, and the children they had in turn, were the fruit of the marriage that Henry II had arranged at Christmas 1181. They were the living legacy of the political deal that had restored Roger's manners and disposed of Ida's future. They were the Bigod dynasty, powerful, long-lived, and central to the governance of East Anglia for another century after Ida's death. Framlingham Castle, which Roger built in the years around 1190 to 1210, remained a Bigod stronghold until the family's male line died out at the end of the 13th century. The castle passed then through inheritance to other hands, to the Mowbrays, to the Howards, to the Crown. But its great curtain walls, which Ida had watched rise from the Suffolk landscape in the years of her marriage, survived all of these changes. They survive today. In 2008, Elizabeth Chadwick published a novel called The Time of Singing, published in the United States as For the King's Favour. It was a novel about Roger Bigod and Ida de Tosney, drawn from the historical record and Chadwick's careful research into the period. It was the first sustained imaginative engagement with Ida's story that had been produced in the modern era. The first attempt to give voice to a woman whose historical voice had been entirely absent from the record. Chadwick's Roger and Ida are fictional constructions, of course. The novel imagines their inner lives, their conversations, their feelings about each other, and about the world they inhabit. But the fictional framework rests on a foundation of careful historical research, and Chadwick was among the scholars who engaged seriously with the documentary evidence for Ida's life, including the Bradenstoke Charters and the genealogical work of Reed and Fair. The novel tells us something important, that Ida's story, once it was properly identified and understood, had the power to compel the imagination. A woman who had been invisible in the historical record for 8 centuries was, when properly seen, a figure of remarkable complexity and significance. The ward turned mistress, the mistress turned countess, the mother of an earl and a dynasty. This was a life worth telling. The broader legacy of the scholarly recovery of Ida's identity extends beyond fiction. In the academic literature on Henry II and his court, Ida now takes her proper place as one of the significant women of the reign. Not the most significant, but real, documented, and correctly identified. In the genealogical literature, her position as the mother of William Longespay is established beyond dispute. In the study of medieval women's history, her case serves as an example of how patient archival work can recover lives that have been lost to misidentification or simple neglect. And in Salisbury Cathedral, where William Longespay's tomb stands in the North Nave aisle, the man carved in stone on the effigy is the son of Ida de Tosney. The arms on his shield, 6 golden lions on a blue field, connect him to his father Henry II through the Plantagenet ancestry. But behind those arms, invisible in the stone, is the woman who bore him, who raised him in the knowledge of who he was, and who was remembered by him when he sat down to give gifts to a Wiltshire priory and named the people for whom he wished prayers to be said. Countess Ida, my mother. We come at last to the end of Ida's story, or rather, to the place where her story ends for us, which is not quite the same thing. The historical record gives us Ida until her marriage in December 1181. After that point, she appears only in the genealogical documentation of her children's births, and eventually in the documents that concern her sons' and husbands' careers. She does not appear in any surviving document as an actor in her own right after 1181. No charter she issued, no letter she wrote, no record of any decision she made or opinion she expressed. She disappeared into her marriage and her motherhood, as most medieval women did. The Countess of Norfolk was present in the world of Framlingham and the Bigod estates for the decades that followed, but the world that recorded her husband's actions and her son's battles and her children's marriages had no particular reason to note her own continuing existence, and so it mostly did not. When did she die? We cannot say with confidence. Wikipedia's article on Ida gives her death date as after 1181, meaning only that she was confirmed to be alive at the time of her marriage, and that beyond that point, her death date is unknown. Various genealogical websites have attempted to assign her a death date, sometimes giving the 7th of March 1226 at Framlingham. But this date is almost certainly a confusion with her son William Longaspace's death on exactly that date. The coincidence of a mother and son dying on precisely the same day, 8 centuries ago, in different parts of England, strains credibility to the breaking point. The more likely explanation is an error in later record keeping, where someone associated William's death date with his mother's name. Roger Bigod died in 1221. If Ida was still alive in 1221, and she may well have been if she was born in the late 1150s, she would have been in her 60s. She would have lived on as the Dowager Countess, a woman of considerable status, but no longer the mistress of the household she had managed for decades. The castle would have passed to Hugh, the new Earl. His wife, Maud Marshall, would have become the new Countess of Framlingham. Ida would have found herself in the position that so many medieval widows occupied, honoured, provided for, but no longer at the centre of the household that had defined her identity. We do not know how long she lived after Roger's death. We do not know whether she saw her son William appointed to his Gascon command, or whether she learned of his shipwreck off the Ile de Ré, or whether she was still alive to receive the news of his death on the 7th of March 1226. These questions are unanswerable. The archive is silent. What we do know, what the Bradenstoke charters tell us, is that at some point in the years of William's activity as Earl of Salisbury, he was thinking of her. He was thinking of her enough to name her in a document, to ask the canons of Bradenstoke to pray for her, to place her within the circle of his family that he wished to commend to the protection of the Church. He did not forget her. Whatever distance, geographical, social, emotional, lay between a countess in Suffolk and an earl in Wiltshire, the thread between mother and son was not entirely severed. Comitissa Ida, Mater Mea. In those 5 words is everything we have of Ida de Tosny's inner life. The knowledge that her son remembered her, that he thought of her when he turned his mind to the people he loved and wished to protect, that she was real to him in a way that he wished to make permanent by writing it down. It is not much. By the standards of what we know about the kings and bishops and great lords of this period, it is almost nothing. But it is something. It is the trace of a real woman who moved through one of history's most extraordinary periods, who bore a king's son and a dynasty's founders, who survived the turbulence of the Plantagenet court and built a life in Suffolk, who lived and breathed and felt and experienced the whole complex texture of a medieval life that we will never quite be able to imagine in its fullness. She was born in Hertfordshire, into a family that helped make England. She grew up in the court of one of England's greatest kings. She bore his son. She married a man whose family would stand at Magna Carta. She raised 8 children in a castle that still stands. And she was found, 8 centuries after her death, in 5 words written in a medieval cartulary in a county she may never have visited. Countess Ida, my mother. To properly appreciate what it meant to be born a Tosny in 12th century England, we must linger a little longer in the world that Ida's ancestors built, because that world shaped everything about her life, from the expectations placed upon her as a child to the position she occupied as a woman in the Plantagenet court. The Norman conquest of 1066 was not merely a change of dynasty, it was a wholesale transformation of English society. In the space of a generation, the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy that had governed England for centuries was almost entirely displaced. The Great Thanes, who had held their lands under the old English system of Buckland and Falkland, who had owed service to the crown in ways rooted in ancient custom, were replaced by a new French-speaking nobility that held its land on entirely different terms. The new system was feudalism in its most systematic form. Every acre of England was held ultimately from the king, and every lord held it on the condition of military service, rendered in person or through knights furnished and equipped at the lord's expense. The Domesday Book of 1086, that extraordinary survey of English landholding commissioned by William the Conqueror, was the visible expression of this new order, a record of who held what, from whom, on what terms. Nothing like it had existed in England before. Nothing quite like it would exist again. The Tosneys, like other Norman families, held their English lands under this new system. They owed the king military service, a specific number of knights, to be furnished when the king required them, equipped and horsed and ready for war. They administered their manors according to the new Norman conventions of estate management. They built their residences in the new architectural style that the Normans brought with them, the great stone halls and towers that were replacing the timber constructions of the Anglo-Saxon period. But the Normans were also, within a generation, becoming English. The conquest was complete enough that there was no going back to Normandy as a permanent home. The families that followed William across the Channel had made a commitment. They had staked their futures on England, on the wealth of English land and the opportunities of an English crown. Their children were born in England. Their grandchildren spoke English as well as French. By the time Ida was growing up at Flamstead in the mid-12th century, the Tosneys were, in a meaningful sense, an English family, a family that happened to be Norman in origin, that still spoke French and maintained connections to its continental past, but that was fundamentally rooted in the English soil it had cultivated for a century. This dual identity, Norman by heritage, English by habitation, was one of the defining characteristics of the Anglo-Norman aristocracy of the 12th century. It meant, among other things, that these families were simultaneously connected to England and to the continent, simultaneously subjects of the King of England and, through their continental holdings, connected to the complex political world of northern France. The Tosney maintained connections to their Norman homeland throughout the 12th century, and when Roger IV de Tosney, Ida's brother, lost the family's Norman lands in 1204, after King John surrendered Normandy to Philip II of France, it was felt as a real loss, even though the family had been in England for generations. For Ida, this dual world meant growing up with an identity that was simultaneously English and French, local and international. She spoke French as her first language of culture and polite discourse. She would have had at least some Latin from her religious education. She may have spoken or understood English, the language of the peasants and craftsmen who worked the Flamstead estates, the language of the country around her. She was a child of several worlds simultaneously, which was the normal condition of the Anglo-Norman aristocracy of her time, and she was a girl in that world, which meant that the question of her future was shaped almost entirely by the expectations that the world had for girls of her class. A noblewoman's life in the 12th century was lived within a tightly defined set of possibilities. She would be educated, she would be married, she would bear children, she would manage a household, and if fortune was particularly good to her, she would outlive her husband and exercise as a widow the kind of independent authority that was almost impossible for a married woman to claim. These were the parameters. Within them there was room for individual personality and ability and ambition, but the parameters themselves were rigid. Ida's father's death in 1162 took her out of the most predictable path of that future, the one where she would have been married by her father to a man of suitable standing at a time of his choosing, in a match designed to serve the family's interests, and placed her in the more unpredictable hands of the crown. The king was now her father, in the legal and practical sense, and the king had his own ideas about what Ida's future should look like. We have spoken already of Henry II and of his court, but to understand what Ida's daily life looked like during the years she spent in that court, before her marriage, during the period of her relationship with the king, we need to paint a more detailed picture of that extraordinary world. The royal court of Henry II was not a fixed place. It was a moving phenomenon, an organism that travelled constantly through Henry's vast domains, from England to Normandy, to Anjou to Aquitaine, and back again. Henry spent roughly half of his reign on the continent, managing the enormous territories that his marriage to Eleanor had brought him, fighting the perennial conflicts with the King of France, and overseeing the governance of a domain that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. When the court was in England, it moved between the great royal palaces and hunting lodges that Henry maintained across the country. Winchester, one of the ancient capitals of England, was a frequent residence. Westminster, near London, was increasingly important as the centre of royal administration. Woodstock in Oxfordshire, with its great deer park, was a favourite hunting ground. Clarendon in Wiltshire had a significant royal palace. There were dozens of other stopping places, castles, manors, episcopal palaces, where the king could be accommodated in appropriate style, that the court visited as Henry moved through his kingdom. For the people who travelled with the court, and there were hundreds of them, from the great magnates to the humblest grooms, this constant movement was the defining feature of their lives. They packed and unpacked, rode and rested, set up and struck camp with a regularity that would exhaust a modern traveller. The roads of 12th century England were not the efficient highways of the Roman period that had preceded them, or the turnpike roads that would follow centuries later. They were muddy, rutted, sometimes impassable in winter, and the movement of a large royal court was a logistical challenge of considerable complexity. For a young noblewoman like Ida, this world of constant movement would have been both exhausting and exhilarating. Exhausting because the physical demands were real, riding for hours, sleeping in unfamiliar beds, eating food that varied wildly in quality, depending on the resources of the place where the court happened to be stopping. Exhilarating because the court, wherever it moved, was the most interesting place in England, full of the most powerful men and women of the age, full of news from the continent and from the distant corners of the kingdom, full of the business of governance and the drama of great personalities colliding. The intellectual life of the court was genuine and remarkable. Henry himself was a learned man by the standards of 12th century lay nobility. He read widely, discussed theology and law with the scholars he kept around him, and had a genuine curiosity about the world that expressed itself in conversations with anyone he thought worth talking to. The clerks and administrators who served as the machinery of royal government were often men of significant intellectual ability, trained in the cathedral schools of England and France, familiar with the Latin classics and the new scholastic philosophy that was transforming European intellectual life. The court was also a place of music and poetry. The troubadour tradition, the sophisticated love poetry of the southern French courts, had spread northward during the 12th century, and Eleanor of Aquitaine in particular was its most prominent northern patron. When Eleanor held her court at Poitiers in the 1170s, She made it into a centre of troubadour culture, a place where the refined ideals of courtly love were explored in verse and song, where the great poems of romantic passion circulated in the hands of nobles and their ladies. Ida grew up within reach of all of this. She would have heard music performed in the great halls of the royal court, the songs of the trouvères, the northern French equivalents of the troubadours, who composed in the langue d'oil rather than the Languedoc of the south. She would have been present at the great ceremonial occasions that marked the royal year, the crown wearings at Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost, when Henry put on his crown in a public display of royal majesty and received the homage and attendance of his great lords. She would also have been present, in some capacity, for the grimmer moments, the aftermath of Becket's murder in 1170, the shock, the papal threats, the public penance at Canterbury, would have touched even the most peripheral members of the court. The Great Rebellion of 1173 to 1174, with its drama of royal sons in revolt, its military campaigns, its eventual crushing, would have been visible in the atmosphere of the court, even for those not directly involved in the politics. And through all of this, Ida was present but invisible, embedded in the court, connected to the king, bearing the ordinary life of the court alongside its extraordinary events, and leaving almost no trace in the documents that recorded everything else. To understand why William Longespay's career mattered, and therefore to understand the scale of what Ida's son became, we need to understand the Angevin Empire that he served, and the extraordinary moment in English history that formed the backdrop to his life. Henry II had built the Angevin Empire through a combination of inheritance, marriage, and conquest that was remarkable even by the expansive standards of the 12th century. England he had inherited through his mother's claim. Normandy and Anjou and Maine and Touraine he had inherited from his father. Aquitaine, the vast southwestern duchy that was one of the wealthiest regions of France, he had acquired through his marriage to Eleanor. Together, these territories formed a dominion that stretched from the River Tweed on the Scottish border to the foothills of the Pyrenees. The problem with this empire was that it was, in every sense, too large to govern efficiently with the technologies and institutions of the 12th century. It required constant royal attention, constant movement, constant presence at trouble spots. It generated conflicts with the King of France, who was technically Henry's feudal overlord for the continental territories and who watched with alarm as his most powerful vassal accumulated resources and influence that dwarfed his own. And it required the loyalty and cooperation of a vast number of local lords, barons, counts, bishops, abbots, whose interests did not always align with the king's. Henry managed this empire with extraordinary energy and considerable success for most of his reign, but he could not stop time. He aged. His sons grew ambitious. The empire that had been built by one extraordinary man's will and energy was held together, in the end, by that one man's will and energy, and when that man was gone, the coherence of the empire went with him. Richard I, who succeeded Henry in 1189, was a great military commander, but a poor administrator of the continental empire. He spent most of his reign on crusade or in French captivity, or fighting to recover the territories that Philip II seized while he was absent. He died in 1199 without producing an heir, leaving the empire to his brother John. John was, by almost any assessment, the worst possible person to inherit the vast Angevin domain at the worst possible moment. He was fighting a king of France, Philip II, one of the most able and determined rulers of the medieval period, who had been systematically undermining English continental power for decades. He was fighting with his own barons, who had endured years of financial pressure and arbitrary governance. He was fighting against the logic of an empire that was simply too large, too internally diverse, and too dependent on extraordinary individual leadership to hold together under ordinary management. By 1204, John had lost Normandy, the original core of the Angevin Empire, the homeland of the Norman conquest, the territory that connected England to the continent in the most direct and meaningful way. The loss of Normandy was a catastrophe, not just politically, but psychologically. The Anglo-Norman aristocracy, families like the Tosneys, who had maintained properties on both sides of the Channel, were forced to choose. You could keep your English lands, or you could keep your Norman lands, but you could not keep both. Most chose England. The Tosneys, like most, chose England. William Longespay operated within this shrinking empire. His career as Earl of Salisbury and royal administrator was devoted, in significant part, to defending what remained, the English kingdom, and the remnant of the continental holdings in Gascony that England managed to retain. The Battle of Damme, where he burned the French fleet, was a defensive victory, an act of preventing further French encroachment on English interests. The Battle of Bouvines, where he was captured, was an attempt to recover what had been lost, a failed attempt, as it turned out, that sealed the loss of the continental territories as permanent. This was the world that Ida's son navigated, a world of shrinking empire, of growing baronial resistance to royal authority, of the great constitutional crisis of Magna Carta and its aftermath, a world in which the son of a Norman noblewoman, who had been a royal ward and a king's mistress, could rise to become one of the great earls of England, could fight in two of the defining battles of his generation, could be buried first in one of England's greatest cathedrals. Not bad, for a woman whom history forgot for 8 centuries. We have spoken several times of Framlingham Castle, the great bygod stronghold in Suffolk that was Ida's home for the decades of her marriage. But the castle deserves a longer look because it is one of the few physical objects connected to Ida's life that has survived the centuries in a form that we can still see and touch and walk around. The castle that visitors to Framlingham see today is, in its essential structure, the castle that Roger Bigod built in the years around 1190 to 1210. The Great Curtain Wall, a continuous circuit of stone punctuated by 13 rectangular towers projecting outward from the wall, was an innovative design for its period. Most castles of the 11th and early 12th centuries in England relied on the motte and bailey arrangement, with a raised mound supporting a wooden or stone keep. The curtain wall design that Roger chose for Framlingham was more sophisticated. It created a large enclosed area within which multiple buildings could be constructed, and it presented an intimidating face to the outside world that spoke of resources and determination. The towers of Framlingham are not designed for active military defence in the way that arrow loops and battlements might suggest. They are towers meant to be seen, to project height and mass and the visual language of power. They say to anyone approaching across the flat Suffolk landscape that the people inside this castle are important, that they are wealthy, that they have the resources to build on this scale and maintain it. They are, in a sense, political architecture, stone rhetoric, the vocabulary of power made permanent in masonry. Inside the curtain wall, during Ida's time, there would have been a great hall, the central space of the castle's social and administrative life, where Roger held court and received guests and administered justice. There would have been private chambers for the family, a chapel for daily worship, kitchens and storehouses and stables, and all the other practical infrastructure that a large household required. None of these internal buildings survive. They were replaced or removed in later centuries, but we can reconstruct their general character from what we know of similar castles of the period. The Great Hall was the heart of the castle's public life. It was where the household assembled for meals, the lord and lady at the high table, elevated on a dais at one end of the hall, with the rest of the household ranged below according to their rank. It was where guests were received and entertained, where disputes were heard and judgments given, where the Christmas and Easter feasts that marked the social calendar were celebrated with appropriate ceremony. Ida presided over this hall. As the Countess, or before her husband's formal confirmation as Earl, as the wife of the lord of the castle, she had authority over the domestic space, responsibility for the hospitality that the castle's reputation required, and a visible presence in the social life of a great East Anglian household. This was not a minor role. The management of a great hall was a genuine exercise of authority, visible to every member of the household and to every guest who entered the castle gates. She would have overseen the feast that marked the great occasions of the year. Christmas, when the household assembled for 12 days of celebration. Easter, the culmination of the Lenten season of fasting and prayer. Whitsunday, Michaelmas, the feast days of the saints, whose particular protection the Bigod family claimed. These occasions required planning and preparation, the ordering of supplies, the coordination of cooking and service, the arrangement of entertainment, the reception of guests, that fell squarely within the Countess's sphere of authority. She would have managed the household's relationship with the local church. The Bigod family had connections with several religious houses in East Anglia, and the maintenance of these connections required ongoing attention. Gifts and grants, the reception of monks and canons, the management of the prayers and masses that the religious houses performed for the family's benefit. The Countess's role in this pious economy of intercession was important both devotionally and politically, and she would have managed, in ways that the records do not preserve, the 101 smaller decisions that kept a great household running: the appointment of servants, the resolution of disputes within the household, the management of the women under her supervision, the oversight of the children's education and religious formation. These were not glamorous tasks. They did not appear in chronicles or earn their performer a place in history, but they were essential, and they were Ida's. The marriage of Hugh Bigod, Ida's eldest legitimate son, to Maud Marshall in 1206 or 1207, created a connection that deserves particular attention, because it linked the Bigod family to one of the most extraordinary figures of the age. William Marshall, 1st Earl of Pembroke, was the great chivalric hero of the late 12th and early 13th centuries. His career was, by any standard, remarkable. Born a younger son without significant inheritance, he had made his way in the world through pure ability, his skill as a knight, his reliability as a servant of the crown, and his almost preternatural political instincts that allowed him to navigate the treacherous waters of Plantagenet politics across 4 reigns without ever making the fatal mistake that destroyed so many of his contemporaries. He had served Henry II, Richard III, John, and Henry III. He had fought in tournaments across France and England, accumulating prize horses and equipment, and the reputation that was the currency of the tournament world. He had governed Ireland as the king's representative. He had commanded at the Battle of Lincoln in 1217, where a royal force crushed the baronial rebels and French allies and effectively ended the civil war that had followed Magna Carta. He was, when he died in 1219, one of the most universally respected men in England, a man of whom contemporaries said, without exaggeration, that he was the greatest knight in the world. His biography, the Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal, commissioned by his son shortly after his death and written in elegant Old French verse by a poet who had access to first-hand accounts of his life, is one of the most remarkable documents of medieval European chivalric culture. It gives us a portrait of a man who embodied, more fully than almost anyone else of his generation, the ideals of the chivalric knight, loyal, brave, skilled in arms, faithful to his word, generous to his followers. When Maud Marshall, William's daughter, married Hugh Bigod, she brought the prestige of her father's name and connections into the Bigod family. And she brought something else too, a direct connection to William Longespay, who was, through the complex web of relationships that bound together the aristocracy of the age, a lifelong associate and near kinsman of the Marshall family. The Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal mentions William Longespay several times, noting his bravery at Bouvines and recording his role in various events of the reign of John and the minority of Henry III. The work treats him with obvious respect, not surprising, since the work was commissioned by William Marshall's son, who was closely connected to Longespay, and since there was the additional connection of Ida and the Marshall family running in the background. For Ida, watching from wherever she was during these years, perhaps still at Framlingham, perhaps already dead, this web of connections would have been visible in ways that we cannot quite reconstruct. She was the mother of William Longespay, who was connected to William Marshall. She was the mother of Hugh Bigod, who would marry Marshall's daughter. She was the center of a network that linked the greatest chivalric figures of the age, without herself appearing in any of the documents that recorded their interactions. The invisible woman at the center of a visible world. The sealing of Magna Carta at Runnymede in June 1215 was one of the defining moments of English history. We have mentioned it already in connection with Roger Bigod and his son Hugh, but it is worth pausing to examine this moment more carefully and to understand what it meant for the family that Ida had helped build. Magna Carta was not, as later tradition would have it, a democratic document. It was not an assertion of universal rights or a declaration of popular sovereignty. It was a baronial document, a list of specific grievances about the way that John had exercised his royal prerogatives, and a demand for specific remedies. Its 63 clauses dealt with things like the rights of widows, the procedures for inheritance, the terms on which the king could levy taxes, the independence of the church from royal interference. But embedded within these specific remedies were principles that would prove, over the centuries, to be of extraordinary importance. The principle that the king was bound by law. The principle that free men could not be imprisoned or punished without lawful judgment. The principle that justice could not be sold, denied, or delayed. These were not new ideas. They had roots in English legal tradition going back long before the Norman conquest, but Magna Carta expressed them with a clarity and specificity that gave them a force they had not previously had. Roger Bigod's presence among the 25 guarantors of the Charter was the culmination of a political career that had been shaped, from its very beginning, by the tensions between baronial independence and royal authority. His father Hugh had rebelled against Henry II. Roger himself had spent years in the limbo that Henry's calculated withholding of his earldom had created. He had watched John's reign with increasing alarm, and in 1215, in his old age, he took the final step of open confrontation with the crown, joining the barons who forced the king to acknowledge limits on his power. Hugh Bigod, Ida's son, was among the guarantors alongside his father. It was an act of political courage, or political calculation, or both, the kind of decision that required a man to weigh the risks of royal displeasure against the possible gains of constitutional constraint. Both Roger and Hugh were excommunicated by Pope Innocent III, who had annulled the charter at John's request. Both were, for a time, technically outside the church, a serious matter in a world that took the church's authority with profound seriousness. They made their peace with the Regency government in 1217, after the crisis had passed and Henry III's regents had stabilized the situation. Roger died in 1221 with his position restored. Hugh held the earldom for 4 more years before his own death in 1225. The Bigod dynasty that Ida had helped found continued. Roger Bigod, 4th Earl of Norfolk, Ida's grandson, Hugh's son by Maud Marshall, was one of the prominent figures of Henry III's later reign. Roger Bigod, 5th Earl of Norfolk, Ida's great-grandson, was Marshal of England and one of the leading barons of Edward III's reign, the man who famously refused to serve in Gascony without the king's personal presence, using almost exactly the language of Magna Carta to justify his refusal. The family's tradition of baronial independence, established in Hugh Bigod's participation in the Great Rebellion and confirmed in Roger Bigod's sealing of Magna Carta, ran forward through the generations. Ida, who had lived her entire adult life within the absolute power of a king, was the grandmother and great-grandmother of men who insisted successfully that kings had limits. The irony is complete. Between Ida's death, whenever it occurred, in the years after 1181, and the publication of the Bradenstoke Cartulary in 1979, nearly 8 centuries passed. In those 8 centuries, the historical memory of Ida de Tosny underwent a remarkable journey from thin documentation to total misdirection to eventual recovery. In the years immediately following her death, Ida was remembered in the way that most medieval noblewomen were remembered, by the people who knew her personally, by the religious houses that prayed for her soul in exchange for the grants that Roger and William had made on her behalf, and by the genealogical memory of her family. The Bigod family knew who she was. The canons of Bradenstoke Priory knew who she was, but this knowledge was local, specific, and attached to living memory rather than to documentary record. As the generations passed, and the people who had known her died and were replaced by people who had not, the living memory gave way to the documentary record, and the documentary record was thin. The charters that named her were filed in archive collections, preserved by the habit of institutional memory rather than by any particular consciousness of her significance. The genealogical records that listed her children were maintained by the families concerned, but without any particular emphasis on Ida's own background or history. The misidentification of William Longaspay's mother as Rosamond Clifford appears to have developed gradually, driven by the same kind of historical gravity we discussed earlier, the pull of the famous name toward the famous outcome. By the later medieval period, it was simply assumed by those who thought about it that Rosamond must have been William's mother. Nobody had looked carefully at the evidence. Nobody had found William's charters at Bradenstoke. The popular identification had the comfortable weight of long acceptance behind it. This misdirection was remarkably durable. It persisted through the Renaissance, through the 17th and 18th centuries, through the great Victorian revival of interest in medieval history that produced enormous quantities of scholarly work on the Plantagenet period. It persisted even as historians and genealogists became more rigorous and more careful about their sources. The assumption was so deeply embedded that it did not seem to require examination. Sharon K. Penman, one of the most respected authors of medieval historical fiction in the 20th century, wrote William Longspay into one of her novels as the son of a milkmaid, repeating the old tradition about Iceni, the low-born woman who was sometimes attributed as the mother of Geoffrey of York. The error had taken such thorough hold of the popular imagination that even careful researchers were carrying it forward without question. And then, in 1979, Vera C. M. London published the Bradenstoke Cartulary, and everything changed. The change was not immediate. The Cartulary was published for a specialist audience, historians and archivists and genealogical researchers who knew how to read medieval Latin documents and how to use cartulary collections as historical sources. It circulated in academic libraries. It was cited in footnotes. And eventually, in 2002, two researchers, Paul C. Reed and Raymond W. Fair, looked at the evidence carefully enough to put the pieces together. The identification was accepted by the scholarly community almost immediately. The evidence was clear, the logic was sound, and the two independent pieces of documentary evidence, William's charter reference to his mother and the Bouvines prisoner rolls reference to Ralph Bigot as William's half-brother, complemented each other in ways that left no room for reasonable doubt. Ida de Tosney was William Longespay's mother. The misidentification with Rosamond Clifford was finally, definitively corrected. This correction did not make the front pages of newspapers. It was not a dramatic announcement. It was a quiet, scholarly consensus, established in the pages of a specialized genealogical journal that gradually worked its way into the reference books and encyclopedias and historical studies that consulted the academic literature. Encyclopaedia Britannica, which now gives Ida de Tosney as William Longespay's mother, reflects this correction. Wikipedia, which covers Ida with a careful article that cites Morris, Strickland, Van Houts, and the Bradenstoke cartulary, reflects this correction. Ida had been found. 8 centuries after her death, she was properly identified, not as a footnote to Rosamond Clifford's story, not as an anonymous mistress, not as a blank space in the genealogy of the Bigot family, but as herself, Ida de Tosney, Countess of Norfolk, mother of William Longespay, royal ward and royal mistress, noblewoman and dynast, woman of the Plantagenet court, and woman of a Suffolk castle, found at last in 5 words written in medieval Latin in a Wiltshire archive. We cannot know how Ida de Tosney spent the final years of her life. The historical record gives us nothing beyond the facts of her marriage and her children, and the slim chance that she survived until after Roger's death in 1221 is neither confirmed nor denied by anything in the sources, but we can imagine, carefully, thoughtfully, with attention to what the historical context allows us to say, something of what those years might have looked like if Ida was born around 1155 to 1160. She would have been in her mid to late 60s by the time Roger died in 1221. This was old age by medieval standards. Not impossibly old, not even unusually old for a woman of her class, who had the advantages of food, shelter, and medical care that the peasantry lacked, but old enough to feel the weight of years, to know that the active portion of life was behind her, to find meaning in the long backward look at a life that had encompassed more extraordinary things than most people of any century ever experienced. She had known Henry II, had been close to him in ways that the historical record can only hint at. She had been present in a court that was simultaneously the most powerful and the most turbulent in Europe. She had borne a king's son, and watched that son grow up to fight at Bouvines and burn the French fleet and stand at the centre of the storms of John's reign. She had married a man whose family stood at Magna Carta. She had raised 8 children, each of them a distinct personality, a distinct life, a distinct set of hopes and sorrows and achievements. In the years after Roger's death, if she was still alive, she would have occupied the position of dowager, the honoured but now somewhat peripheral figure of the previous generation. Framlingham would have been Hugh's, and then when Hugh died in 1225, Roger IV Earl's. The castle that she had overseen for decades would have been managed by other hands. The household she had run would have had another woman at its centre. This was the normal trajectory of a medieval noblewoman's life, and it was not experienced as a tragedy, or at least it was not normally experienced that way. The dowager had her dower lands, the portion of her husband's estate that was legally set aside for her use during her widowhood, and she had her household and her religious obligations and her continuing connection to the family she had built. She was not cast out. She was accommodated, respected, and cared for. We do not know whether Ida, in her final years, knew what her son William had written about her in the Bradenstoke Charters. The charters were made during William's lifetime, before her death if she outlived him, though we cannot be certain whether she did or did not. Did she know that he had named her, in the formal Latin of a legal document, as his mother? Did she understand that this naming might matter to posterity, that the thread of documentary evidence he had left behind might eventually restore her identity to a world that had misdirected its attention elsewhere? She could not have known this, of course. She had no way to foresee the archival scholarship of the late 20th century, or the publication of medieval cartularies by regional record societies, or the genealogical detective work that would eventually connect the dots. She simply lived her life as most people do, without any particular consciousness that the record she was making, or failing to make, might one day matter to people centuries in the future. But it does matter. It matters because Ida's story is not only Ida's story, it is the story of all the medieval women who moved through extraordinary events without leaving the kind of trace that history tends to preserve. It is the story of the silence that surrounds most lives, even lives of genuine significance, and of the work that can be done, when the documents survive and the researchers are patient and careful, to break that silence and recover something of what was lost. Ida de Tosney, Countess of Norfolk, mother of William Longespay, born in Flamstead, Hertfordshire, sometime around 1155 to 1160, died somewhere in Suffolk, sometime after 1181, in a year that no one thought to record. Found 8 centuries later, in 5 words: Countess Ida, my mother. Let us take one final long look at what Ida de Tosney left behind, not as a catalogue of facts, but as a meditation on the shape and meaning of her life. She left a son, who was the first person buried in Salisbury Cathedral, a building that still stands today, that is still visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year, that is still one of the most magnificent examples of medieval English architecture in existence. In the north nave aisle of that cathedral, William Longespay's stone effigy lies in peaceful dignity, the arms of his family carved on the shield at his side. He is there because of Ida. She left a dynasty. The Bigod Earls of Norfolk, Hugh III Earl, Roger IV, Roger V, were among the most prominent families of 13th century England. They were men of real consequence in the governance of their country, participants in the constitutional struggles that shaped the development of English law and political culture. Their participation in Magna Carta, their role in the great baronial movements of the 13th century, their management of the vast East Anglian estates that formed the Bigod inheritance, all of this grew, in part, from the marriage that Henry II arranged at Christmas 1181, when he gave Ida de Tosney in marriage to Roger Bigod, and restored 3 Norfolk manors as part of the deal. She left a connection to some of the greatest figures of the age. William Marshall, through his daughter's marriage to Hugh Bigod, was connected to Ida's family. The Marshall connection meant a connection to the chivalric tradition at its highest expression, to the man who was called the greatest knight in the world, to the biography that is one of the most extraordinary documents of medieval chivalric culture. All of this ran by the thread of Hugh Bigod's marriage. Through Ida, she left a correction to history. The misidentification of William Longespay's mother as Rosamond Clifford was not a trivial error. It distorted the historical understanding of Henry II's court, of the relationships among his bastard children, and of the role that the Tosney family played in the Plantagenet world. Correcting it required the preservation of a 13th century cartulary, the scholarly care of 2 20th century genealogists, and the broader institutional infrastructure of academic historical research that allows such corrections to be made and recognized. All of this was necessary because Ida had been lost. The recovery of her identity was, in its own modest way, a contribution to the accuracy of historical knowledge, and she left, above all, a question, one that we cannot answer, but that we should not stop asking. What was it like to be Ida de Tosny? What did she think and feel and want and fear? What did she make of the extraordinary life she was given? The Norman childhood, the royal court, the king's attention, the political marriage, the children, the castle in Suffolk, the long years of ordinary, extraordinary life. We do not know. We cannot know. The archive is closed on the inner life of a woman who left no letters and no diary and no chronicle account of her own experience. She is present in the documents only as a function of other people's needs. Her father's ward, the king's mistress, Roger's wife, William's mother, never as herself, speaking in her own voice about her own life. This absence is a loss. It is one of the great ongoing losses of history, the silence of the women who did not write or were not written about, the inner lives that disappeared with their bodies into the ground, leaving behind only the external record of what they did and whom they knew and who they bore. But the fact that we cannot fully know Ida's inner life does not mean her life had no inner dimension. She was a real woman. She experienced the full range of human feeling, joy and grief and fear and hope and love and loss. She watched her children grow. She outlived possibly her husband and perhaps her son. She grew old in a world that was very different from the world she had been born into, and she was remembered by her son in the charters of Bradenstoke Priory, in 5 words of medieval Latin, by the scholars who found those words and understood what they meant, by everyone who, having heard her story, pauses to consider what it means to live a life that matters without leaving a mark that the world recognizes until 8 centuries have passed. Countess Ida, my mother, she was found. We began this evening in Flamstead with a Norman girl in a house that bore the weight of centuries. We have followed her through the courts of kings and the corridors of power, through the intimate shadow of a royal relationship, through the transformation of wardship into marriage and mistress into countess. We have followed her son across the battlefields of France and the great halls of 3 English kings. We have followed her husband through the constitutional drama of Magna Carta, and we have followed the thin thread of documentary evidence, 2 charters in a Wiltshire cartulary, a prisoner roll from a French battle, that finally, 8 centuries after her death, restored her name to its proper place, Ida de Tosny, born in Hertfordshire, into the oldest tradition of Norman England, died in Suffolk, in a castle that still stands, mother of an earl, wife of a Magna Carta baron, royal ward and royal mistress, the woman behind 5 words in medieval Latin that changed what we know about who she was. She was not forgotten forever. She was found. Good night.